show. My name is Yossi Galliano. I'm the village manager of Pinecrest. Welcome, everybody that came out in the middle of the day. Hopefully you have your bellies are full and you're comfortable. It's a little cold in here, but we turned off all the fans. With me, I have Chad Friedman. He is one of our village attorneys, and Steve Olmsted is the village's planning director. So what we're going to go over is about 20 slides that pretty much just lay out everything that's happening now in terms of council action. And then once we wrap up with the presentation, we'll open it up for questions and answers, and we'll be here as long as needed to be here to answer any of your questions. So with that said, I'm going to just turn it over to the village attorney.
Excuse me, before we begin, could you tell us please exactly, so if you all have your handout so that we can follow along?
Sure.
We're going to get the first handout so that we can.
Right now, we're going to be going over this presentation. This is a copy of the slide presentation that you're going to be seeing. In addition to that, on the in the back, we have multiple documents. There's 3 ordinances that the council is going to be considering for second reading in December or January, and I'll go over that a little bit more in detail. We have copies of each of the ordinances in the back, so you'll have the actual ordinance, but in the presentation I'm giving you, I'm going to give you the highlights of what the ordinances are doing, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I'm asking that everyone please wait till the end. If you have any questions, make mental notes for yourself, and then we'll go over everything at the end of when we conclude the presentation. Okay.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So I was asked just to kind of kick off and provide.
Can you hear us okay, or do you need
Not
us to-
really.
Okay.
You I can hear fine, Yossi.
Okay.
He speaks a little softer.
Okay. I'm a former cheerleader, so I can project.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully this is better. So just to frame kind of out the meeting a little bit, the administration asked that I advise everyone regarding the Citizen Bill of Rights, which is the Miami County Charter. Throughout this process, which is going on for, I guess over a year, there's been some misinformation being spread that maybe some of the administration has not been saying things that were correct or truthful, so we just wanted to at least explain to everyone that underneath the county charter, which bounds the village, that there is truth in government, there is Citizen Bill of Rights, and everything you're going to hear today is going to be factual, truthful, and I don't want anyone to think that there's any misinformation being said from the administration. So with that, I'll turn it over to Yossi, and she'll go through the presentation.
And the caveat is that if we provide any misinformation, it could be grounds for removal of your office and your job. I have 2 toddlers, and I'm not interested in losing my position anytime soon. So with that said, we'll go through this. And again, like I said, please hold your questions till after the presentation. It shouldn't take too long. Thank you. Okay. So what we're going to be talking about is exactly what council is doing now. They are in a 2-step process of approving 3 different ordinances. And those ordinances, we're going to go in detail what each of them does. The process, they've already had first reading of the ordinance that occurred on October 12th. And now we are anticipating that on December 13th, they will hear the items on second reading at a public hearing. So the purpose of this is also so you understand and have a good understanding of what's in and proposed in these new laws. And then if you have any issues or would like to speak to council on any of these issues, you would go to one of the public hearing that's scheduled for now on December 13th. Next slide. Okay, so what, did we miss? Go back.
You this one.
What was that? Okay. All right, my bad. All right. So I just want to go over real quick what is existing on US1 right now. In other words, what is happening in US1, what's already allowed on US1. So US1 currently allows the entire length of US1 allows what's called mixed-use development. Mixed use with commercial or office. That's allowed along the entire length of Pinecrest Parkway, and it allows up to 4 stories of commercial/office mixed use. That's the maximum that somebody could build there. It also allows for what's known as 0.73 floor area ratio. So I'll go over that a little bit more, what that means, but that is what the existing code allows today. Next slide. What the existing code today also allows is something that's called an alternative district. That means that a developer today has two choices in these areas. There's 3 distinct areas that exist already as overlay, and they're called alternative districts. They're basically right across the street from the metro stations. So you have one towards the north, which is what we call the Kendall Drive Alternative District. And then you have the 2 that are side by side is where the Roasters and Toasters Shopping Center and where the Captain's Tavern is, where the ramp on-ramp hugs all those properties. So those are existing alternative district areas. And in those areas specifically, they allow also mixed use, but also with residential component. And what's allowed currently in those properties is 4-story max, residential mixed use with commercial, and 12 dwelling units in the acre. And the floor area ratio, again, I'll explain what that means, is at 0.73 in those 3 specific areas. Next slide. So again, what we're looking at and what we're talking about today is going to be the 3 ordinances that are going to be coming up for second reading and what each of those ordinances does. Next slide. Wait, before you do that. The first ordinance amends the comprehensive master plan. The comprehensive master plan is like the village's development Bible. It's what takes care of, our growth management. That comprehensive master plan, any amendments to the comprehensive master plan have to go to the state. They review it and they provide us feedback. That is the only document of the 3 that we're considering that have to go to the state for input. The next ordinance, the second ordinance, is the one that amends the land development regulations. That's basically the code, the regulations of how a developer can build on a particular site. That particular ordinance is the longest one, and it's about 5 slides worth of information. We'll go through it very slowly and make sure everybody understands what it entails. And then the third ordinance is the one that amends the zoning map. Okay, so in a nutshell, the quick and dirty about all these 3 things is it's only going to be affecting primarily only affecting 5 areas, not the entire corridor. And I'll go over what 5 areas these changes will affect. So as I mentioned, that we currently have an alternative district in 3 areas in Pinecrest. Those are the ones that are represented in the blue. That already exists today. And if you recall, those areas have a dwelling unit per acre of 12 units, and it has a floor area ratio of 0.73. So the new ordinance and everything that we're going to be talking about is now going to be looking at 2 new ones, which are the ones on the left, 2 new districts, one on 136th Street or 104th Street, and then the expansion of the existing one that's on Kendall. Go to the next slide. So here's the one on the Kendall, what it looks like. So what's in blue is what currently already exists, and this ordinance and these ordinances would be expanding the area for the Kendall Alternative District to the areas that are now highlighted in yellow. In the areas a little further south, like I mentioned, the Roasters and Toasters and the Captain's Tavern, those districts there, the area they cover is not changing, that stays the same. Then we have a new district area, which basically straddles 104th. As you can see there, what you will see is on the south side, you would see the gasoline station, and you have the office building and Deborah Longo's building where the dermatologist is. And then to that, the north of that, taking all the way to where Evelyn's Pizza is. And then you have the new district on 136th Street, which goes from 136th Street to Sunnyland Park. So the properties that are covered in that district include where the Home Depot is, where the Publix is, where the Macy's is, where the Burger King is, where Guadalajara is, where the new Baptist Health Center is, and the old BB&T Bank. So all of that is what encompasses that district. Next. Okay, so now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what each ordinance says. So as I mentioned, you picked up the ordinances. There's different things. There's one that on the top reads Comprehensive Master Plan. Right. Comprehensive Development Master Plan. So this is the actual ordinance language with the strike through and underline any new information that's in here, but in a nutshell, I'm going to go over what this, these are, I think it's like 3 pages. This is what it does. Number one, what the comp plan amendment does is change the name of these districts. Currently, they're called the North Pinecrest Business Alternative District, so we're dropping the word north. So now these districts are all going to be referred to as Pinecrest Alternative Business District. Number two, they conditionally permit mixed-use commercial with residential in these alternative districts. So what does that mean? Conditionally permit. So when you talk about development, you either can develop by right or as a conditional use. And when it's called conditionally permit, that means that if a developer wanted to build something in accordance with these new rules that we're going to talk about, they would still have to come before the council to get approval. It's not by right. They just can't come in and build it. They still have to come and go through a process that involves a public hearing for whatever project they want to do. The comp plan amendment ordinance expands the existing Kendall Drive district, like we mentioned before, to those yellow areas that are alongside those. And then it creates the 2 new districts, the one on 104th and 136th Street. And then it talks about 2 very specific things, the floor area ratio and dwelling units per acre. So I'll take the dwelling units per acre because that's easier to explain. We're going from 12 dwelling units an acre, to 35 dwelling units an acre. Okay, so that means that if it were to develop, it would be an increase from 12 to 35. Only in those 5 areas. Thank you. Again, everything I'm talking about only addresses those 5 districts, okay? And then we get into the floor area ratios. The old code said that you develop at 0.73 along the entire corridor, right? And also in these districts. Now the code will read that if you're developing a 1-story building, you would be developing at 0.40 floor area ratio. If you're developing a 2-story building, you would have a 0.51 floor area ratio. If you're developing a 3-story building, you would have a 0.70 floor area ratio. And if you develop 4 stories, you get 1 FAR. What is not permitted and not included, just to clarify, is we are not going over 4 stories on anything. Everything stays within a 4-story envelope, 51 feet height maximum. We are not allowing high-rises. We're not allowing hotels. We're not allowing roads that can come in from the back. So everything, all ingress and egress from these properties, if they were to be redeveloped, would have to happen coming off of US1 Pinecrest Park. Okay? So the whole idea, and I'm going to talk about in more general why this is preserving the residential character of Pinecrest. Because we've done some things that are more specific in the land development regulations that are going to add protections to people that live immediately abutting the commercial property. So before we go into that, I want to explain FAR. I'm going to turn it over to our attorney because it's a little technical in nature. I'm hoping he can answer it in a way that everyone can understand, but please, even though I said to wait to ask for questions or afterward on this, I think it's important that you know, so raise your hand if you don't understand, because you definitely want to know what this means before we go through the rest of the presentation.
Okay, so floor area ratio is what it is. It's a ratio. And it's the ratio between a building's total usable floor area and the total area on the lot in which the building stands. As Yoshi said, currently in these areas it's a 0.73 floor area ratio. So what does that mean? So if you had a 1 acre lot, you would take that 0.73 and you would times it by 43,560 square feet, which is the size of an acre, and you would come up with a number that would be 31,798 square feet. So under the current code, if you had a 0.73 FAR in a 1 acre lot, you could potentially build 31,798 square feet on your property. Now, that is just the overall most that could be built. In reality, you probably won't be able to achieve that because you have to factor in height, setbacks, open space, lot coverage, and parking. And when you factor in all of those factors, typically the FARs aren't as high as the code would permit. You want me to go into the, okay, so what's being proposed underneath this ordinance is to go from a 0.73 FAR to a 1.0 FAR. So, given the same example, if you had a 1 acre lot and which is 43,560 square feet, instead of multiplying it times 0.73, you multiply it times 1, because it's 1.0. So that would mean that you could build 43,560 square feet on your lot as opposed to the 31,000 numbers. So the net difference in FAR on its face would be about 12,000 square feet on an acre lot. But however, like I said before, not every lot will be able to obtain that because of height, because of setbacks, parking, and the like. FAR does not speak in terms of residential density. It just in terms of commercial intensity and development. You may want to ask how we came to the 1.0 FAR, going from 0.73 to 1.0. In 2020, the Village Council started studying the Pinecrest Parkway as part of their typical planning process that they would do. Shortly after that, in the springtime of 2021, in March of 2021, the village became aware that the county was also studying the busway. And they were planning to adopt an ordinance that was going to apply in the cities and in the county. And that ordinance, at the time, in March of 2021, was going to preempt the cities and require certain development to occur. Over the next year, so from March of 2021 through May and then through the summer to September of 2022, the cities, including the Village of Pinecrest, fought back with the county, and ultimately what was agreed to at the county level was the county adopted an ordinance requesting that all cities within the rapid transit zone, which is for purposes of Pinecrest along US1, that you adopt a minimum FAR of 1.0. Not density, not residential density, but a minimum FAR of 1.0. So back to my example again, that's, if you have an acre lot, you're basically, what the county has asked and what the village is proposing to do is that the square footage on an acre lot would be increased by potentially 12,000 square feet of development. Do you want me to?
So, hold on, let me go, hold your question, if you will, go ahead.
Well, just a clarification.
Sure.
So to go to 1.0, though, you said you get there when you have a 4-story building.
Correct.
Yeah.
Which means a four-story 1.0 would essentially be covering 25% of the lot.
Right, in that example.
Yes.
Correct, so if you, in the four-story building, would allow you to achieve a 1.0 FAR. If it was a one-story building, you would never be able to achieve it, and that's why the village has it at a lower level, because of the parking and the setbacks. And I think the diagram,
We have another
you have
diagram.
another diagram that will show you that you'll see.
Right. Okay, so we'll continue on, and then if we have to double back with this, we can when we get into the questions and answers, because we were gonna try to hold the questions for after the thing. This is not a good representation. I have a better slide that will show you what our new code is gonna do in the following slide. This is just to give people an understanding of what FAR was. Okay, so we already went over, go back to the one that talked about the comp plan amendment stuff. There. So the comp plan ordinance only does these 5 things. It establishes a new dwelling units per acre at 35. It establishes the FAR the way we talked about with 0.40 for 1 story, 0.51 for 2 story, 0.70 for 3 story, and 1 FAR for 4 story. It expands the Kendall Drive alternative district and creates 2 new districts, one on 104th and one on 136th Street. It conditionally permits mixed use with residential, and it drops the name North from the definition of what we title these things. Now it's the Pinecrest Business Association. That's the business district. That is what the comp plan amendment does. That is what was sent to the state for their comment. And that is what we will be waiting on the state to provide us commentary by the end of November. And so this should be going before council for second reading December 13th. Okay, now we're going to jump to the LDR. The Land Development Regulation Ordinance is the beefier handout, the one that has, like, I don't know, there's, I want to say there's 19 pages, so it's a little thicker. Again, you have in front of you the strike-through, underlying, the technical, what language is changing, and so you can take the ordinance back if you want to, but I'm going to go over the highlights and tell you basically what this does. Okay, so firstly, the Land Development Regulation Ordinance protects existing single-family neighborhoods from encroachment of incompatible development, incompatible impacts of any of this type of development, including noise, glare, traffic congestion, or associated impacts. It permits business and professional offices, general retail services, and restaurants without drive-throughs. It conditionally permits the use of alcohol on premise. So anytime that somebody wants to sell alcohol there, they would have to have a public hearing before council. It conditionally permits structured parking garages. So if any of these developers want to build a structured parking garage, they would have to come before council at a public hearing. Public utilities, all permitted uses, mixed use, including residential, office, or commercial, all those things still have to go before the council in a public meeting. So they're all conditionally permitted. That means there's no guarantee that council will approve any project. They still have to go through the public hearing process and government facilities as well. And it requires that all the development access to any new development, ingress and egress happen off of Pinecrest Parkway, unless otherwise determined by the village council. So what that tells the developer is, when you're gonna come in and for the new development, we want you to put all the egress and ingress coming off of US1, stay away from the residential areas in the back. So this one gets a little bit more into the floor area ratio, this little picture here. But again, to reiterate, now the land development regulation does the same things that the comp plan amendment does. It establishes a hard stop at 4 stories or 51 feet maximum. It reiterates the same thing with the floor area ratio. 1 story at 0.40, 2 story at 0.51, 3 story at 71, 70, I'm sorry, and 4-story at 1. So this shows you, for example, the first one. First story, the maximum in an acre that they would be able to build is 17,424 square feet. On a second story building, you would have a 2-story building that would allow 11,108 square feet per floor. On the third story building option, you would have a 30,000, almost 30,500 square feet with roughly 10,000 square feet each story. And then the fourth one with the maximum that would be allowed at 43,560 square feet, or just shy of 11,000 square feet each floor, up to 4 stories. Again, it establishes the maximum dwelling unit an acre to 35 dwelling units an acre. It also raises, in our code currently allows residential to be only 600 square feet. It actually raises that to a minimum of 1,000 square foot. So you can't build an apartment or residence for less than 1,000 square feet. And then it details architectural standards, open space standards, streetscape standards, the vehicle circulation standards, parking standards, lighting, signage, and anything that has to do with unloading or uploading of commercial stuff. It gives you the details of how all that would have to occur on the property. So when you ask yourself, what does 35 units an acre, dwelling units an acre look like? We have examples currently in the village. The one on the left is Kendall Gables Apartments. That one is actually built out 2 stories at 49 dwelling units an acre. And then you have Dayland Grove Apartments. I know they're not as beautiful because they're older buildings, but the Dayland Grove is also another existing example in Pinecrest where you have 34 units an acre. So that gives you, and that one's within a 4-story envelope. So that gives you a visual of what this represents. When you talk about 35 dwelling units an acre, more or less, this is what those developments within a 4-story maximum, what it would look like. So when I mentioned earlier about providing protections that don't exist now for the residents that are adjacent to these commercial properties, I think this is one of the better things that happened with this new proposed code. It's called like transitional zoning. So basically what this is doing is asking that any residential development as part of a mixed-use development happen at the rear so that residential is matching with residential. It also lowers the height for that residential to 2 stories. So where these mixed-use developments occur on a property and they're close to the residents that are immediately adjacent, now they would put residential back there and drop it to 2 stories, okay? So that provides them a lot of protection because right now, by right, with the existing zoning currently, a property owner can develop 4 stories commercial right up against those properties. But now, if they pick the mixed-use development with residential, the residential component would be towards the residences, and it would be dropped to 2-story maximum, so that there's a transition. This code also provides for what they call opaque landscaping buffer, which is that in addition to having this transitional zoning, they would also require major landscaping buffer towards that rear, so that the homes are buffered from even any townhome or anything that would be happening on the commercial property side. And then it establishes a maximum building length of 165 feet. They also, these alternative districts also highlight amenities that don't exist now. They try to promote certain things happening in this new development that include things like more sidewalks, bike trails. It would include mature canopy trees. It requires that any trees that are brought in have to have a certain diameter, between 18 and 20 diameter for the trunks of these trees. It provides for rooftop amenities, landscaping, green roofs, sustainable design, colonnades, and the ground floor and public art. And in the cases where a developer wants to build in a structural garage environment, it allows for that, and it could be above ground or even underground garage systems. So I mentioned that there's things that this ordinance does outside of these 5 districts, and there's only 3 things. Number 1 is they've now created or will create, if this passes, an architectural review board, which is an independent board that will review any site plan along the entire corridor that requires village council approval or site plan approval. So there'll be an added layer of review by an independent architectural review board. And then you have some definition changes. One is the definition of building coverage now includes areas covered by overhead trellises of 600 square feet in area, and also changing the definition of holiday to include Juneteenth. And you'll ask yourself, why is this thrown in there? And it's because all the holidays have an impact on when developers can do construction on site. So, you know, these ordinances typically have to have notice, and it costs a lot of money to advertise, so we fixed those small things that were in the code that needed fixing that don't necessarily impact anything in those other districts that you mentioned. Okay, then the final ordinance that council is considering is what's called the zoning map ordinance, the zoning map amendment, and it's basically what you have here. This is the zoning map. That ordinance does 3 things. It creates or highlights those areas that we talked about for the alternative districts, and it leaves the underlying zoning exactly the same, with the exception of Gary Matzner Park, which is now zoned residential, and the zoning map amendment is changing it to Parks and Recreation as a zoning use. The Gary Matzner Park is on the corner of Kendall Drive and 67th Avenue. Next. Okay, so some of the questions that we've heard just throughout the months of concerns with when introducing the residential component to those 5 areas was a lot of concern about the traffic that they generate. And so I wanted to show you how, from the manual that we use from a planning perspective when we evaluate any projects that come in, even if we didn't have the residential component, any project that comes in, we evaluate for trips to make sure that they're not creating a lot of traffic or issues with traffic. Commercial and like what they call retail and office zoning provides for more traffic. It's more intense from a traffic perspective than residential use. So what happens is, if you think these numbers represent the peak AM hour, that's when you have the most traffic ever, and you'll see that for retail, 1,000 square feet of retail generates 6.41 trips. The same 1,000 square feet of office generates 1.56 trips. And for mid-rise residential, for the same 1,000 square feet, it generates 0.35 trips. So just from a traffic intensity perspective, it's not as intense to develop residential than it is to develop in a commercial way. Okay, next. Okay, so we've gone through things fairly quickly, but we're here, like I said, for as long as you need to go over any questions that you might have. I think it's fairly straightforward what we provided. There's no hotel, nothing that goes over the 4-story limit. What is happening is an increase to dwelling units from 12 to 35. What is happening is a increase in the size of an apartment. It can't be 600 feet anymore, it has to be 1,000. And then the floor area ratios have changed. So from 0.73, which is what we have currently, to what I mentioned, the 4-story step process. Okay? Up to 1 point. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah. That's all very clear, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a specific question about an area right now that's zoned RU4,
Okay,
which is shown as high-density residential,
right.
which,
Pull it up and,
if I understand correctly, high-density is like 50 units per acre or something like that.
Right, so.
So how would the code apply? Because the code you're saying is 35, and it has a new FAR that would apply as well.
So, as I mentioned, the underlying zoning stays the same. So a developer has a choice. He can either build with the underlying zoning, which in the RU4 allows for 50 dwelling units an acre currently, or if they take on and want to build under the new code, the alternative district, in that case, they would be introducing mixed use, but the dwelling units an acre is going to go to 35. So in that case, in that property in particular, if they went with the alternative district, they would lower the density. Make sense?
Okay,
Okay?
so they're grandfathered.
They,
It's not that they're grandfathered, they have every single right to the RU4 zoning, but if they want to take advantage of the mixed-use components of the Pinecrest Business Alternative District, then they do give up some density that they would otherwise be building underneath the RU4.
So they have a choice.
They have a choice.
Okay, but that's for the current owner.
It
You
doesn't
could have
matter.
changed the zoning, I guess, to no longer be RU4. The current owner would be grandfathered, and any future owner would have to comply with.
No, so under zoning, we don't deal in terms of ownership. We zone, for purposes of the density and uses there, we do not zone as, this owner gets this or this owner gets that.
but what he was saying is, could council have decreased the zoning to a lesser density? They could have, but that is not what they've done here. They've left the underlying zoning intact, so no property rights are being affected. This is just an alternative approach. So you can't have it both, right? They would have to say, oh, we want to build RU4 residential to the 50 dwelling units per acre, or if they want to do mixed use approach, they would have to then do the 35. They wouldn't be able to do both.
And is there FAR .73 at the 50 units per acre?
Yes. Yes. So all that stays exactly the way it is today. None of that has changed.
Can you
I'm
just
gonna
point
go
out the
here.
RU4 about that? Can you just point out on the map?
So the RU4s, there's two properties in Pinecrest that have RU4. There's, here, let me show you.
It's on the larger map.
Yeah, here. So you have RU4 is right here. And you have RU4 where La Reserve is, which is right next to the 104th Street district. But one of the things that you'll notice is you can, just because you have the ability to build at a certain density doesn't mean that people actually build at that density. La Reserve is the perfect example. When they built La Reserve, that was already 50 units an acre, and what they ended up building at La Reserve is more like 30. What is it?
The reserve is 24.
It's 24 units an acre. So a lot of times developers won't take advantage of the maximum that the code allows either. Okay, now, there was a question, go ahead.
Thanks for all this information. So has there been any builders or developers on the 5 proposed sites that have either approached the city or the council, whoever, started asking about doing some of these opportunities?
No, we've had, there's the Spectre property folks who have, I'm sorry? And Captain's Tavern. Captain's Tavern right now, in that area, there's new owners. So we know that they're likely going to be coming in, but they haven't approached us yet with any ideas or concepts or anything like that. Same thing with the Spectre property. They, for at least since I've been here. Oh, I'm sorry. The Spectre property is where the Home Depot site is. So the Home Depot site is another one that we know because they've expressed that they were considering redeveloping, but we haven't seen anything, they haven't submitted anything to the village yet. The other one that I anticipate will come sooner than later is the Macy's site. So what we look at when we're looking at possible future development is just the lifespan of the buildings that are there. When they start looking a certain way, you kind of know that they're gonna either come in and put some lipstick on it, or they're gonna tear it down and build something brand new. So the Captain's Tavern area, to me, that's gonna be the one that's gonna come up sooner than later. Yes, ma'am?
Being directly affected by Captain's Tavern area, I live on 74th Court.
Mhm.
I cannot get out of 105 Street at all because of traffic on 77, which is bumper to bumper in the afternoon and mornings constantly, all the way up to the bridge, all the way to 104. You can't make a left turn there because you can't see any traffic coming from 104. The other day, I almost lost my life pulling on a green light at 104, making a left turn, and a guy just went straight through the traffic light on red. It's constant. It's not like once and now and then. It's 4 times that I've personally experienced it. So I don't understand how you could possibly increase
Improve.
any density there at all. And imagine you turning the 5 residences at 104 when they're already building some station across the street, which now will mean more pedestrians going to a bus station. I just,
So, I hear you. What I can offer you is this. The alternative is, I don't know that anything will actually come and be built. Like I said, some of these districts have existed for 20 years and we haven't had any developers come in. So these are alternatives that we put on the books in the hopes that if something will get redeveloped, that it get redeveloped in a more modern way. To your point, right now, as of right, if a new developer wanted to rebuild in that corner, they can tear down and put 4 stories of office and commercial as of right. And as of right, we know that trips generated by that use is more intense, you have more traffic than a residential use. So the concern of introducing residential into the mixed-use component, I wanted to mention that because I know that there's a lot of concern about traffic in general. But traffic would happen if this was done as a 4-story commercial, which they have the right to do according to their zoning right now. So what happens from a planning perspective, what we're doing now, these are planning exercises and code exercises. When and if a developer comes in with a project, they submit their paperwork, including traffic studies. That's when, because a lot of people were asking in the earlier meeting we had one this morning, like, how do you know what the traffic is going to do? We don't know, because until you have an actual developer coming in with a concept that says, we're going to do this, this, and this, you don't know how many trips are going to be generated. When that process happens is when the council determines if there has to be mitigation, if they have to do like no left turns, no right turns, if they have to do certain things to keep from obviously making things worse. The whole purpose of putting these things near transit stations is to try to keep people or promote people using transit as opposed to vehicle and getting into a car. So that's why specifically these areas have been picked because they're adjacent or right across the street from a transit area. So it's meant to promote non-vehicular traffic. It's meant to hopefully spur that people use mass transit as opposed to having to get in a car and drive, you know.
and how's that working out?
Well, you know, I know a lot of people that use transit in Pinecrest that use the metro stations. We have, you know, we're lucky that we have 2 metro stations. I don't know how many people would actually walk across and get on the bus rapid transit. I don't know the answer to that question. But the concept is that's what they're trying to achieve with that concept. Yes, ma'am.
To piggyback on Angela's thoughts about 104, you said earlier that like entry points to these places, right? Would the RU4 multifamily high density, what's allowed now, right at 104, would that be accessible from 104 or only accessible from US1? So I guess my question is, would they be able to be coming in and turning in what looks like a Parks and Rec facility? Or would they enter the next street up?
So, like I said, what we have right now, we don't know what the development's gonna look like, but if a developer were to come in and take all of those properties, all the ingress and egress is supposed to come in and out off of US1, not coming in from the residential. We wouldn't go, they wouldn't come through our park or anything like that.
Right. That was really the
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
So 104 could in no way be like an entry point for them?
Correct. Nothing from the back, because a lot of, like, go back to the one on 136th Street. One of the concerns, for example, on 136th Street, no, one more, is, I'm gonna just get up, I'm not gonna use this, but I keep thinking about it. Like, one of the concerns is like, well, like, right now you have 136th Street, 132nd Street that comes here. And right now, let's see what other street, there's no other street that cuts in through here. So one of the concerns was, well, are they gonna all of a sudden open a street through back here to reach this? And what this code does not allow that. It requires that all the egress, originally, one of the ideas was to have like an alley back here, a street, and the council took that out. So that is not in the code either. All the street, all the access has to come in from US1. Unless council says otherwise. Like, there is a caveat in here, but it's part of the conditional use. So if a developer came in with an idea, they would have to do a lot of convincing, because the code kind of guides developers to do everything coming off of US1.
But do we have a hearing on that?
You're not gonna come to the park anyway, I'm sorry, yes.
But we, as the presidents, we would have to go to a hearing?
We would go,
Okay.
yes, you would
It
go.
couldn't be done sidebar?
Correct.
Okay.
All these things, and that's something, that's what I mentioned, conditional use. All these things are conditionally used, permitted uses, which means that anything that happens would still have to have a public hearing. So you would have the developer come in with a hearing with a whole nice, boards and decisions and discussions and traffic studies, so that residents can get up and, give their assessment of any concerns that they might have. Yes, ma'am?
Would this ever go to a vote to the citizens of Pinecrest?
This, what we're doing right now, no, once they have the second hearing, which is planned to happen in December, this becomes the code for the village.
So the
If it
citizens
passes.
really have.
If it passes, if council passes it.
So we don't really have a choice. So the council's the only one that has.
The council, yes, that's what they're elected to do. This is typical. The council, as a course of their business, this is what they do. They constantly are looking at codes, shifting codes, changing codes. That's what their primary purpose
People
is.
don't have time to come to this kind of meeting or your hearings or whatnot. So all of a sudden, you're gonna have something you've decided without a majority of, there's what, 20,000 residents in Pinecrest?
Right.
And how many of us are here?
Right.
How many are
So
coming?
this is informational. The decision-making meetings are at public hearings. Residents you can contact each of your elected officials, give them your input. Like, this is meant to tell you what they're considering, so that if you have lingering concerns after we have this discussion, that you can, let them know that. And because that influences potentially their vote when they make those decisions at the next hearing.
I think we
Yes,
should
ma'am.
So we residents have a voice. We have to use our voice. We have to email, or we have to go to the public hearing where these conditional uses, conditional changes are going to come in. So we have to get off our duff and let the council know. The council votes on the decision.
But that's hard to do when you hold a meeting at 1 o'clock on a Wednesday.
That
There
is
were
very
three
rare.
meetings today.
That was this first reading.
Folks, I did this town hall meeting at different times, because people have different, but we're having it today, we have one at 9, one at 1, and one at 6. But this is not a decision-making type of meeting, this is just informational. Council meetings, when they're decision-making meetings, are typically on a regularly scheduled council meeting at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Yes?
So just a little example, if Macy's, which is on US1 and also 132nd Street, they have access to both of those.
Mhm.
If they wanted to bring in a residential use and redevelop it, you're saying that this, as it currently stands, they couldn't do it because they're zoned business.
There's own mixed-use commercial office, right.
So they couldn't bring in the residential piece.
As it stands right now, no.
But if they wanted to,
After, if this were approved.
if this is approved, then they could only have access to US1 unless they came in with some design to want access off 132nd.
132nd, because it already exists on that property, would likely be okay. I think what the intent of this is that you're not gonna build any new streets that don't already exist coming out of the residential. Some of these properties are really big, and the concern was, even though we're adding residential on the rear, that they didn't want those residents accessing the property from the back, coming through the residential neighborhood. So they would still have to have access from the US1. So anything that deviates from the egress and ingress of US1 would obviously still have to come to a public hearing of the council. Makes sense? I have two, let me take yours because you had it up
Thank
first,
you.
yeah.
Just a very basic question. We're talking about existing PBAD versus proposed PBAD. The proposed expands on the existing. How exactly is that going to benefit us as Pinecrest residents? I mean, why are we doing this in the first place?
So the council,
I must be missing something.
these changes that are being proposed are meant to
But they're
improve.
expanding.
They're expanding in the Kendall Drive area. They're expanding, can you pull that one up for a second?
No, I
think
have
that's a
that
jump.
here. They're expanding in 3 areas.
Oh, you're talking the new areas? Okay, yes, those are meant to be, they're trying to address the issue of providing for redevelopment opportunities that are more in line with what's called lifestyle centers, which is the newer way of developing shopping centers as opposed to the strip mall approach. Typically, those more modern type of strip mall developments, which
I
now
get that part, but you're still infringing in more, this is an expansion.
Residential.
right, but what I'm
I
trying to
know
explain
you
is,
can make it pretty and more modern and all that, but you're still expanding.
right, there, the
I'm
idea.
not clear, why would we want to do that?
So, like I said, there are areas that are already commercially zoned.
Yes.
What they're trying to do is introduce a residential component into those already commercially zoned areas.
Why would we want to do that?
Because council feels that they'd like to provide opportunities for people, for example, who want to age in this area, but don't want to necessarily live in an acre or 2 acre lot anymore, to diversify some of the housing stock that we have.
So
It
that's
also-
what's behind it.
Go ahead. Right, and also, right, the protection of the 2-story, when, it's gonna provide for transitional, so you're not gonna have commercial right away to the residential. So there's
So you're
different,
expanding residential,
you're expanding
but
residential.
in smaller spaces, basically more
Correct.
population
Right,
for Pinecrest.
correct, correct. Yeah, depending on what the developers provide, and, we don't know, I can't tell you, I don't think that a developer's gonna come in, like, we didn't see it as a La Reserve. You don't necessarily develop the maximum, but it's meant to be to provide additional housing stock for people that maybe want to stay and living in Pinecrest but don't want to keep their homes, larger homes, to be able to downsize. Also, a lot of talk about people that have, adult children, but they can't afford to live in the bigger homes, so they would have something close to the, family, but not, the more expensive homes that are east of that.
And it's unlikely that this is going to occur on all of the parcels within these alternative districts. There are some smaller parcels that probably will not develop as planned. And these alternative districts, the 3 that are in place right now, have been in place since 2002 for 20 years. And there has not been any proposal for mixed-use development in those. So it's reasonable to expect that some of the larger parcels will develop for mixed-use development, but not all.
Right. So not everything, like I mentioned, I think Macy's is a good one that is prime for redevelopment, but I know that they were asking some crazy amount of money for that, just that property. I want to say like $30 million for that property. The Spectre property is likely going to be redeveloped sooner than later. The Captain's Tavern, again, I think will likely redevelop sooner than later. But other than that, you might have, one or two little things come up. But nothing that comes to mind. Yeah.
Yep, you didn't touch on it. Online, when I was reading, there were the things you listed, I think you called them enhancements.
The amenities.
And it said that if a developer implemented 4 out of the list, that they could be entitled to going to 6 stories and some
Right.
other things which would.
So that was, we had a visioning process, and the architecture, the citizens committee that developed this vision had a system where they would incentivize to be able to go above the 4 stories. The council is deviating from that recommendation. They are not going to do that. What they instructed staff to do was to take those amenities and build them into the code. So now there's no added bonuses. It's within a 4-story envelope. If you want to avail yourself of that district, of that approach, you have to include those amenities. So it's not, and it's not incentivizing anything other than that.
Okay.
So it's a hard stop at the 4 stories.
Okay.
Mr. Guilford, did you have a question?
Yeah, okay, you're moving, right now, in the new areas, there is 0 residential allowed, correct? And right now, in the existing alternative areas, there are 12 units per acre allowed.
Correct.
So we're talking about an increase of 66% in units on the existing alternative areas and 100% increase on the new areas, correct? So if somebody were to buy or develop the new areas to the full extent, how many units is that?
35 units per acre times the number of acres purchased.
How many acres are there, Steve? That's what I want to know. How many units are you looking at if somebody were to,
The Spectre property is a 10-acre property.
so you're looking at 350 units there?
If you developed 100%.
That's what I'm saying, just, you gotta take worst case scenario when you look at these
When you
things.
look at it though, like you're not gonna necessarily develop 100% because you have setbacks that you still have to meet, and you still have the FAR situation, so there's FAR.
But you
and
got
height and corridors and stuff like that. So you're more than likely going to have, in a realistic, and this was Mr. Kulik, who was one of the architects that served on that committee. He opined as a professional architect that it would be more likely developed at around 25 units an acre, because you have common areas and things that play into it. Yeah. But I did have I don't know if you came in a little after I had shown the slide of what 35 or 34 units an acre at 4 looks like.
Yeah, it's that growth thing, that's
big
that
growth.
ugly, disgusting thing.
I know, it's kind of ugly.
Yeah, and it's how many
I don't want to
acres?
offend anybody that
Yeah,
lives there.
and so
We
you're
love all of
looking at,
Pinecrest.
just assume with setbacks and stuff, you're looking at 300 units on the Spectre property. At 4 people a unit, that's an additional 1,200 people in the community.
Let me ask a question
Go ahead.
of my planning director real quick. Can they build it 100% as residential, or does it have to be residential mixed use? Does it have to have a component of mixed use in there?
Well, the land development regulations talk about mixed-use development, which would be a mixture of commercial and residential.
So it wouldn't completely all be able to be developed as residential?
No,
Is there a breakdown?
no, there's not.
But it cannot be fully residential. So it's not a replacing from commercial to residential, it has to be mixed use. There has to be a mixed use component.
On the code,
Well, what's-
it just says, are you for residential?
And usually it's 2.5 people per unit is the,
So one of the conditionally permitted uses is all permitted uses incorporating a mix of residential, commercial, or office uses.
And do we have ratios set up for that, Steve? As to
No.
how much is office and how much is
No.
retail and how much is residential?
No.
So theoretically, I could come in and put a 100 square foot residential or retail space and then build the rest of it out.
Well, keep in mind, it's a conditionally permitted use, and the village council would have the
Well, so
ability
far,
to review that.
so far, every survey that's been done on this project has been negative, and every workshop has been negative. And you've got a charter amendment pending that would stop this from going forward without a village-wide vote. And for some reason, the council seems hell-bent on jamming this through prior to the amendment being passed. So the council doing what's best for the community doesn't seem to be really comforting at this point.
Prior to what amendment you passed?
There's a charter amendment that would
Well, we don't
require.
know.
Can we,
I said, if it
Oh,
passes,
I see.
but why would you run this through before the amendment even is voted on?
Yes.
Now, the amendment may lose, you could be 100% right,
go
Charlie.
ahead.
Is there information regarding how the property values of price per foot could become diluted? And my second question is, what would that do to the parcels of property that currently exist if they became multi-use? Was that taken into account when it was negotiated on what you ultimately are allowing that is somewhat, in theory, beneficial to the residents of Pinecrest?
So there haven't been any negotiations with any developer. Maybe I'm not understanding the question.
No, for a prospective developer to imagine that there is more value in it being residential because of the prestige and the price per foot of your average Pinecrest unit, I would think that someone should have taken into account just how lovely a deal that is to go from Macy's property or Captain's Tavern, or it could be a business and not too many businesses based on the flow of traffic or what they want to sell wouldn't pay more than X for that property. But if they can combine it with residential and the price per foot of a residence is so much greater, that it's a phenomenal deal. And it seems like in talking about how this is less dense and less traffic, forget all that. It's sort of like a windfall to the lucky person that does buy the commercial location and then knows that residential has a greater value. That's one question. But in general, there are other properties in other parts of the country, whether it be Beverly Hills or whatever, it would seem like part of the cachet of saying that you live in Pinecrest is that a certain percentage of residents live there and that the property sizes tend to be X square feet on an acre. So if now you're making, I don't know what the number is, 6 times the residences, then it's almost like it would water down the price per foot of someone valuing Pinecrest as a great area.
The closer you are to the corridor.
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, what you're concerned about is that if you have this type of development, that will depress your property values. Okay, so the question would be, in the last 20 years, since you've seen all the development at Bayland, right, which is right across the street, has that depressed any of your property values?
It's not
No.
right.
So my point is that this type of development, because of what it brings in terms of other amenities, will likely improve your
I'm not asking you to
property.
speculate. I'm suggesting that there would be comparable areas, and I'm not too familiar with Doral or Beverly Hills, but I'm saying where there have been existing properties that are multi-million, what happens when you add X tens of thousands of apartments? I don't think logically people say, yes, I want to see a lot of 600 square foot units. And, you know, part of saying that you live in Pinecrest is one can already imagine the size of the lot and the size of the home. So it would seem that it would dilute it.
Couple of corrections. First of all, a correction to Mr. Guilford's question, and my response rather. All new development must have a minimum of 75% of the ground floor occupied by office, restaurants, institutional, covered parking, or retail uses. So the bottom floor, the first floor has to be 75% commercial or office, not residential.
Okay, but that then in turn means the opposite, 25% of the ground floor can be residential and the other 3 stories can be residential.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that could potentially be. And then with regard to property values, the developments that I'm familiar with that include mixed-use development in Miami-Dade County and Collier County, and the minimum unit size, again, has been increased from 600 square feet to 1,000 square feet. But in those mixed-use developments, they typically are very high-end units that sell for over $1 million, the ones that I'm familiar with, or close to it. It's not expected that this limited mixed-use development adjacent to US1 is going to have a negative impact on any residential values in the interior of the village of Pinecrest.
Well, that's a speculation. What I was thinking was that actual work was done, like to compare when Coral Gables, for instance, started developing condos compared to people that had residences. Is there not data that you could find an area of an affluent town where the average house is on not the average house, but a certain percentage are on big lots, big houses, and see what the price per foot doesn't rise at the same rate that it had been for prior decades.
The ones that come to mind, and this is anecdotal because I don't have the numbers, but the places that come to mind, and I know Steve was alluding to Naples or even Boca, like Meisner, in those areas, those are mixed-use developments they have mixed-use developments with residential component. And to my knowledge, I would be hard-pressed to come up with an example that actually depressed property values. Because if you have really good development, if you have really good development and it ends up being like, what this is meant to be, these things are meant to be lifestyle centers. If you travel to some of the more modern cities where you see these mixed-use type developments, it's meant to be self-sustaining, keep a lot of entertainment, a lot of foot traffic for people, for the businesses, so it's a win-win. It's not like what happened in the old Cocoa Walk that didn't have enough residential supporting the Cocoa Walk, which is why it kind of went downhill. That's really not in a perfect setting. If a good developer came in with an idea, that would not be what we would be getting here. We'd be getting more amenities for the village that we don't have now. Nicer restaurants, places to go that would be more modern than just the strip malls, and all of that should raise the property values. The fact that now the people that live, right, which are the ones that are most affected, the people that are adjacent, immediately adjacent with their home backyards, getting these commercial, now instead of potentially having, full commercial back there, they're gonna have the transitional residential component. So they're gonna have another neighbor as opposed to, alleyway with a truck at 5 in the morning picking up garbage. So there's, from a quality of life perspective for those people, that's why I say I think it improves the situation. Having that residential, abutting residential at a 2-story height limit makes a big difference for those people, especially the ones that live right across.
Just to clarify, the Macy's property, you said you don't know necessarily who would want it, but they were asking something 35 million. Do you have anecdotal information as to what that property might have been valued at previously? That it seems like it might be a windfall for the people.
I could tell you that the Macy's owners, the Macy Corporation owns that property, and I could tell you that there was a developer that was trying to get them to sell the property so that they could develop like a mixed-use type of development there. This was probably 10 years ago. And the Macy's would not back down from like $35 million. So financially, it was not going to make any financial benefit for any developer to come in, which is why we still have what we have it. Yes, sir.
We're concerned about the properties behind Route 1, not this one. Now, I have a comment about the studies. I came to many meetings, and I am yet to see a resident of Pinecrest excited about the plan. Yet, you guys are very excited, and I have to say the study you present is very biased. It's like promoting what you are promoting, and I'd like to see, like for example, when you say, is there a traffic impact? The word no is so strong to say no. That's hard to believe. Parking is gonna be a major issue, and the back road are gonna be crowded. Now people are gonna throw in parties. And I have to say, the uses public transportation can work in Manhattan where everybody is using public transportation. No one is going to come and live in Pinecrest and take his kids to school and then after school activities by bus. Nobody, because the setup is not there for public transportation. If the city was fully reliable in public transportation like Manhattan, then you don't think of owning a car. But I'm not gonna, even if I move to an apartment, me, my son, my wife, and then we have extra car. But it's not gonna work without cars, because there is schools, there is after schools activities, there is going out, and not everything is individual. I mean, the city is not anything like that. I'd like to see counter argument presented by you. And please correct me if the percentage for residential that we are allowing in this project is 62%, 62.5% of the any new development, because 75 of the first and second floor, that leaves 2.5 out of 4. 2.5 out of 4 is 62%. And we use the term mixed use already exists. That's like mixed use of commercial and the retail. But now when you're allowing 62% of residential, that is a major thing. Parking and traffic is a major concern. The value decline is also another one. Right. So those are three things. Please, I mean, show me resident. I mean, I'd like to hear not from official. I'd like to hear 10 residents, 15, excited about this, and tell me your point of view. And
so
that's why
I will ask those folks that are in favor of this to reach out to this gentleman afterward and share your thoughts. I can tell you that my role here is to just give you information on what council is considering as in terms of the traffic impacts of a given development. We don't know what those are until a development comes in. Why? Because you can be able to build 4 stories, but they might come in and only build 1 story. And the traffic impact of whatever that may be, we won't know until we have a proposal.
Well, I'll tell you, feasibility, nobody's going to come and tell
So, but if the apples and apples,
to make business sense, we want, and like this gentleman said, we want to look at the worst case scenario.
Okay.
Let's say it
let's
did
look at worst
all,
case scenario.
and now it is 62% residential. Or
Hold on. Let's do worst case scenario, because we're talking hypotheticals. We're talking hypotheticals.
Yes, but what's the maximum?
So I'm going to do worst case scenario. Worst case scenario, today, a developer can come in and build 4 stories of commercial and office development with 0.73 floor area ratio. Okay, so that's hundreds of thousands of square feet of commercial and office, which I've shown you, right, is more intense from a traffic perspective than residential development.
We can argue that, because I'll tell you, the commercial traffic is diversified throughout the day. The residential, everybody in the morning taking
the pictures that I showed you,
really, yeah.
the chart that I showed you,
and parking is a major issue.
What I showed you is the worst AM
well, I'll tell you, this is
peak
biased.
traffic.
I have to say it is
I can only
not
give
independent.
I can only give you the facts. The facts that I'm giving you, which is what we are changing in the code, then you're asking questions about traffic and how that's going to impact. And my explanation is we don't know until we know what the development looks like.
You did the study and mentioned all the positives.
No, how can you say you
My point to you is that until...
You did a study and you mentioned all the positive things, and the study is only mentioning positive.
We're not talking about the study, we're talking about the ordinance.
I attended one presentation for the study, and the study only mentioned positive things. No counter argument, no negative impact, no what's the impact on the existing residents, what's their point of view, how traffic is gonna be, this, that, it's
so
all like, it's hunky-dory.
I don't want to give homework, but I'm going to give you all homework, okay? Go on Google and look up pros and cons of mixed-use development with residential. And that will give you the the studies that you'll see from all the planning universities on the pros and cons, okay? What I can tell you about mixed-use
So you're
residential.
telling us that
I'll tell-
that we have to go research?
Ma'am,
What
and
I'm
study
reading
studies?
is
Listen, I
information.
can answer you. They are excellent. In new development area, not rezoning, and that's a major difference. If we are developing a new area, what you are proposing is excellent, and I cannot argue against it. To the contrary, I am for it. But if you look at Cary in North Carolina, Cary in North Carolina, this is how they are developing it. But it's a new area. They don't come inside existing housing and that areas like inside Chapel Hill and do this. They do it in Cary next to it. So when you are rezoning, it's a completely different ballgame than developing, and that is a major issue.
Okay, so again, to just clarify, we're not rezoning, we're providing an alternative district approach.
You're
So
expanding.
we are
There is
simply
a
providing a developer
listen,
the opportunity to
increasing,
choose
I have
one
to
or the
say,
other.
increasing, allowing 62% housing,
I misspoke.
that is a major rezoning.
I
62% resident, now it is commercial and retail.
Okay.
You tell me allowing
Sir,
60%.
I'm not here to
I'm-
convince you.
No.
I'm here to educate on
Me
what the
neither.
council is considering. So your position, which I value, and if you feel strongly, then you should advocate against it to the elected officials who are the ones who are going to be making the decision. Because my role here is simply to educate. And I misspoke earlier, it is a rezoning, my attorney was speaking to me behind. It is considered rezoning, but it's an alternative district. Yes, sir.
Yeah, two
You
things.
can I take her first, because she had her.
Did the council study how it's going to impact the public schools, for example, all these families that are going to come and with a car and go to the school and the space and all that?
So from the public school perspective, I can tell you that the majority, or a lot of the people that attend the public schools now in Pinecrest don't necessarily live in Pinecrest. They're coming from other areas into Pinecrest.
I'll answer it. So under Florida law, the public schools are required to be evaluated when you have a development with residential like this. So when the actual development were to come in, at that time, the site plan will be sent to the school board. The school board will do what they call a school concurrency determination, and then they report back whether there's adequate capacity or not. If there's not adequate capacity, the way it works is the school district looks to adjacent school areas. If there's still not adequate capacity, then the development cannot move forward until there's a proportionate fair share agreement where the developer contributes to provide more capacity for schools. So it will be evaluated, but it's not evaluated at this point, it's evaluated at the time the development comes in.
And school capacity is one part of the concurrency and level of service analysis that occurs. There's also an analysis with regards to available parks and recreation space. There are levels of service and standards in our comprehensive plan that require, for example, 3 acres of parks and recreation land in Pinecrest for every 1,000 population. So there's water and sewer, solid waste, schools, roads, transportation, levels of service, stormwater drainage, and parks and recreation that all have to be analyzed with any development proposal. And so if it's determined that a particular development is going to cause any one of those adopted levels of service to fail, the village council could presumably deny the development or require the developer to provide an increase in an improvement in levels of service to accommodate that proposed development.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, two things. One is, I guess if the village didn't do some of this, we would still be required by Miami-Dade County to increase the FAR to 1.
No.
Is that correct?
Yes.
So some of this argument about density is driven by Miami-Dade County, not by the village of Pinecrest. This is a way, in my view, a way to mitigate that to some extent by saying, how can you get to 1 through a sequence of steps?
It's not the density. So Miami-Dade County's ordinance is only requiring a minimum FAR, not a residential density. The residential density is something that the village council is considering irrespective of what the county has
So the county stuff has no impact whatsoever on our having to have residential or not.
But it does.
Right,
It
but
does
what-
on the FAR.
Right, but what I'm saying is, right now, like, along the US1 corridor, the development is 0.73. We're required by the county to go to 1. So a developer that could only develop to 0.73 before, commercial and not residential necessarily, could go to 1.0.
But I don't think
It's
that's
only
actually
around
correct,
the- only
because
around
it's
the
only around
transit-
the zones,
the
and it's
zones.
only a certain distance from the zone.
Correct.
Which in Pinecrest only comes partway into the Home Depot property, so it's not a blanket one.
No, that's not correct. It's a quarter mile of the
There's
transit
two
way.
different
A
standards.
quarter mile from the transit way only won't cover
Covers
the
all
far
our entire
side.
commercial district, the whole commercial corridor.
There's
don't
two
think that's-
standards. There's two standards. You're correct in part, there's two standards.
And there's a mitigation for abutting residential as well.
That's correct.
Yes.
There's one standard that deals with what they call the urban centers, which is around the falls, around the Dayland South, Dayland North, where you have the Metro rail stations, okay? That's one standard that the county has. The county has had since the 1980s, frankly. The other standard is in between those areas, which is the quarter mile, what Steve was saying, and a half a mile, which is the 1.0 FAR, which really goes across into commercial corridors, and maybe some other residential. However, underneath the ordinance, single family and two family are excluded, so it protects it.
And there's a mitigation for abutting residential
You can-
against that as well.
As far as an determination of incompatibility, yes, there's some flexibility there, and the village has exercised that here.
But again, to my point, the Macy's site could be developed probably at a 1.0 density rather than 0.73.
Under
Everything
the
else
county's
may be-
RTC ordinance.
Yes.
Okay, so some of this argument, again, I'm not enthusiastic about this, but the village is trying to steer developers to do something that might be in their better interest. The second point I'd make, again, not being enthusiastic, but if you look at the US1 corridor and you look at the east side of the corridor, those existing developments, whatever properties, don't necessarily increase our property values. They are not what I'd call attractive,
I agree.
representing Pinecrest. So
Yeah.
anything we do that improves that mitigates some of the negative effects of the development, should be embraced.
Exactly.
Yes, Mr.
So, thank you. So, talking about residential development, let's take the Home Depot site or the Macy's site. The alternative, if we don't change the code and we leave it commercial, is that we have a multi-story, 4-foot commercial. So there's a Target on one floor, there's a Home Depot, which we all love Home Depot, I don't want to ever see that go. And like we do in Wynwood, right? A Publix we already have the Publix, but what I'm driving at is you could have that multi-story commercial with multiple different commercial enterprises operating on a large scale, which would be way worse than what we have today with the Home Depot, and would be way worse than what we would have with some mixed-use residential.
But you'd be 12,000 square foot less than one, and you'd be limited to 4. And I have a question for Steve. What 4-story, the current height restriction on 4 is how many feet? Less than
45 feet.
Okay, so we're also going up 7 feet in height
Yes.
to accommodate this, so we're going up higher than 6, okay.
51.
All right, so I never was good at math. So that's, so you're going up 6 feet in height and you're putting an additional 12,000 square feet in.
Right.
Okay.
But I'm gonna leave it toward US1, and I'm not gonna impact it.
Well, I got another question for Steve on that one too. So Steve, if a developer comes in on this alternative thing, and I assume it's your question, Steve, so I'm not trying to ignore you.
That's
Steve.
fine.
And
You can ignore me all the time.
So, the way that you've got it buffered out from the residential to the commercial, with the commercial towards the front and residential towards the back, if somebody came in and developed and just did commercial, would you still have that buffering in height, or would you be 4-story against the property line?
4-story against the property line.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Under current code.
Under current.
Under the current code.
Under current
And
code.
last question for whoever is, under the current code at .73, can I do lot development 1-story 7.3, or to get to the 7.3, do I have to step
No,
up?
it's stepped up also.
It's stepped up also.
Yes.
So I can't come just plop
7-3.
7.3 on the ground. I've got to step up to reach that.
Yeah. Do you remember what they are?
Yeah,
And it's currently staggered similar to what we're talking about here?
yes.
Okay.
Patsy, you had a question?
Well, I have a lot of concerns too. Having lived here in Pinecrest all my life and grown up before there was even a Dayland, I live right next to Dayland on North Kendall Drive, and I have a lot of concerns because I keep hearing the word conditional, conditional, conditional. In other words, whether you all approve or don't approve, the council, we're concerned and so on. At the end of the day, I've been going to these public hearings now, and it seems that at the end of the meeting or whatever, the council ends up approving anything nevertheless, despite of all our concerns. So what I see here happening in the future is, wait a second, Steve, please. I've been waiting my turn patiently, and now I forgot half of what I was going to explain. But I live right there on North Kendall Drive, there by Gulliver, by Maxner Park, and all that has been torn up. Nobody has mentioned the environmental impact of all this overdevelopment. Look at what's happening in Brickell and so on with all these gust winds and hurricanes and EMs and so on. And here we are tearing down all the greenery, and we're not preserving Pinecrest, and instead we're replacing it with a lot of concrete in just to fill a lot of these developers' pockets. I don't know, I'm not an urban developer, I'm not an architect, I don't know anything, all these fancy words that you guys use and all these fancy maps, but all I know is that this has to be done incrementally, little by little, poquito a poquito, and just kind of like play it by ear. Look at what happened over there on Sunset with the bakery center, a big white elephant, mixed use, and it's a bust. I would really appreciate if the council could reconsider December 13th, apparently is the deadline here, where they're gonna have the second hearing and decide on all this, and maybe stretch it a little bit more until after the new year. And here, the part on this handout here, where I know you mean well, Josie, and nothing personal. I think you guys are very well, educated and prepared and all that good stuff, but no mention is there here, for example, of like the gentleman in the light blue back there said, the traffic analysis, we might not be traffic engineers, but we live in Pinecrest. The future is right now. The future is right now. We're experiencing it. We don't have to be expert in any of these things here, because it's just going to get worse and worse. Conditional, all of a sudden, what that means from my experience so far in front of the council is that, conditional, and what does that mean? That, we appear to, go through all the justice here, and at the end of the day, nothing really changes. Now, I'm directly impacted by this Maxner Park. It's a disaster what they're planning for that corner, man, that you mentioned on 104th. What?
Stick with the...
Okay, 104th Street here. Okay, what the gentlewoman here just mentioned, earlier, that the people running the lights, the traffic, the safety concerns, no mention, and this is part of the plan because you mentioned it here in one of these plans about the bike trails and all that stuff that's happening with the SUP and the parks and the recreation and all this stuff. People running the red light there on North Kendall Drive, let's be specific, North Kendall and US1. People running the lights at wide intersection, everything there, it's Maxner Park there, people are gonna be turning in all directions. We're living in Miami. Nobody has considered here the demographics of the way that people drive here in Miami. There's a lot of cons here and not pros. So it should be done, hopefully, incrementally, little by little, and not just, shoved down our throats here on December 13th, and then we all show up and go through all the hearings and everything, and at the end of the meeting, 3, 4, 5 hours later, approved.
So if any of you have participated when council has had conditional use permits come before them or conditional use developments come before them, it's a public hearing. They take testimony from different parties. People can speak on the issue, and many times council has taken positions that were not, arguably in favor of the developer, and has said you can't do this or you must do this to mitigate X, Y, Z. So, the process is what it is, right? We establish code exists, whatever that code says. When a developer wants to come and develop, even if we didn't do any of this, tomorrow, Macy's or respective property wants to be redeveloped, even if it says commercial office, they'll come in. That's when you do concurrency review. That's when we know what they want to build and what the impacts are going to be to all those levels of service. And that's when we, as the village, dissects it and then makes determinations on how to mitigate for issues. Before that, you just don't know what, it's hypotheticals, and that's where, I think, I understand that you all would like to see numbers, but we're dealing in hypotheticals. I'm gonna ask you and then her. Go ahead.
I just wanted to backtrack to your former point that it's not as though we have developers lined up down the road jumping on these new areas that are being rezoned.
This could be on the books for 20 years.
They've already been on the books, as the code has already been there, so I don't understand why so many people are being spun up like this is gonna happen next week. I mean, we don't even know yet when or if these properties are gonna be developed.
Right.
And quite frankly, Macy's is not a great looking area. Captain's Tavern, not a great looking area. If we had a better looking area that offered some mixed usage, I don't necessarily think that that's a horrible thing. I think 104 is a bit horrendous because that particular intersection with Target and gas stations, and it's just where the Palmetto's coming in. I think that's particularly hairy, but I think there's a lot of people that are spun up in advance when we don't really have any impending. Do we have people lined up jumping at these properties?
No.
Yes. The Spectre property on 136th Street has hired a top zoning attorney to deal with their property. So yes, there are developers that are interested.
They can do it anyway.
Yes, that's true. That's true, but that's why we have to take care of
Well,
what
yes.
we choose to have.
So, I had mentioned it, and forgive me if I'm repeating myself, because we had a meeting earlier, so I don't remember exactly if I said it here or not, but we have not been, there's been talk about the Spectre property being redeveloped. There's been talk about the properties behind the Captain's Tavern, but we have not seen anything. They have not come to the village to provide us copies or a view of what they're thinking, and that has not happened yet. So it's likely that it will, but we do not have first-hand knowledge of that. Yes, sir.
Take it.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Yep.
Mike, I'm sorry, I have already told you to go.
So, I think this is a great idea, because I think we have to give a palette to developers and architects to see what could be done along the Pinecrest Parkway, US1 Boulevard, and it gives carrots and it imposes sticks to the property owners, to the property developers. This is what we need to do, and we need to move forward with providing this, because we have a busway which we, the residents of Dade County, are spending millions of dollars on our mass transit. We have to provide residential along that corridor. We have to hope that people who are going to buy or rent are going to use the mass transit. We have to educate human beings that because of global warming and climate change, we have to change our lifestyles. If we don't, our grandchildren are going to have serious, serious problems. So you say it's not going to happen, and you say it's too much density.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? We have to change.
Let's keep
And
it
we have to provide it.
folks, I know that everybody has passions in different ways, but let's try to focus this so that we can wrap it up to any lingering questions that you might have. Go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry, I know there's still a lot, we'll go through all of them. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, I'm trying to keep it to technical questions.
Please.
Parking. In terms of the redevelopment or potential redevelopment, rezoning of these areas, and I didn't go through the whole handout, what are we doing to address the increase in overnight and residential parking or static parking that will hit these sites in the event there's a residential component, to also accommodate then the trip traffic that normally will accompany retail and office?
Now, the parking requirements in the code for all uses. So,
But that's just for the residents. He's talking about people who come to visit, multiple cars.
Right, what I'm talking about, Steve, is there a change in the code or the zoning code proposed to take into account the fact that we now have a potential residential component which introduces a static parking situation with multiple cars versus a retail component which is one car?
yeah, each of those uses is going to have to provide parking pursuant to the schedule of parking requirements in the code of ordinances.
So,
I think the answer to the question is we're not changing the parking standards in this ordinance.
okay, just so I understand.
The current code standards will continue to apply.
All right.
And be enforced.
So you have to have X amount of residential for residential units. You would have to have this many parking for retail, this much for office. Those standards are not being.
All right, just so I'm a simple guy, so just so I understand. If I have this much commercial space, the code says you have to have X spots per 1,000 square feet of commercial retail space.
Right.
So I take my site plan and I say I've got this much retail space, I gotta supply that many spots. Then I got an office component and the current code says you've gotta supply so many spots per office. So I've got to supply, in addition to the retail spots, I got to now supply those office spots. And then I got so many residential units, and our current code says you got to have so many spaces per resident. And then on top of those two requirements, I now have to supply the required residential.
That's
Is that
correct. I mean, there are some changes in the code. Restaurant, office, or retail is one space per 500 square feet.
Is that an up or a down,
One
Steve?
per unit. Excuse me.
Is that an up or a down from existing?
It is one space per 500 square feet for restaurant, office, or retail. Quite honestly, I'd have to research that, and I'll let you know. But
That's an important consideration if we're cutting spaces.
An increase.
I'm sorry, Steve?
He's going to pull it up. He's going to pull it up.
Okay.
While he's doing that, can I so just to clarify, there was a zoning attorney present last council meeting on behalf of the Spector family requesting an increase in Pinecrest consideration to increase the maximum height to 6 stories. And you guys had said no, or
That's correct.
council said no, we're not going to do that.
Right.
The other question I have is, are leases between a landowner and a tenant a part of public record? In other words,
No, we don't. I wish. Yeah. I can tell you that Home Depot has a long-term lease because they are considering a redevelopment of that Home Depot to, remember the Expo Center? I heard
The big one.
that they're looking, because that happens to be one of the more popular Home Depots in the country, believe it or not. And they want to make that like a model Home Depot. So my suspicion is that the landlord has a long-term agreement with Home Depot, but we don't have access to that information.
Now, to piggyback on what you said, you're just looking at Pinecrest, but 136 also goes to Palmetto Bay. And that shopping center there has turned into a nightmare. And with the way they divided the street, I don't know if it was for quote unquote the flooding or whatever there was in that little section right at the end of the commercial property, that has turned into the worst traffic. Just like when school started and people were going to Office Max to get their supplies. The traffic was past 82nd Street just to cross. It took you 10 lights to cross US1. That's just on a 2-week basis. Then now, in that shopping center, which is all commercial, the Mia Salon is now turning in, they bought, or they leased out another section toward the Party City. You never find parking. So if we then on the other side turn this into a mixed use, that's going to be a complete nightmare. And I don't know what studies you guys are looking at, but if you're just looking at this one parcel and not looking at the whole area,
Underground
it
garages.
doesn't.
Underground garages.
With flooding?
Underground.
We don't look at the properties outside of the village for
But you have to.
zoning
I know,
perspective.
but you have to.
So,
Do you drive by there at all?
of course, yes, I go there all the time, but my point is, and I'm sorry if they're speaking about the parking next to me, but they're trying to come up with the responses on that question. So we don't look at what though that's a commercially built property, they
Palmetto Bay,
developed
I
in
know.
accordance with whatever codes are in Palmetto Bay.
But
If
doesn't
we
it
didn't do any
have
of
to
this,
marry? But
if
doesn't
we
it
didn't
have
do
to marry with us on 136?
Yeah, no, if we didn't do any of this, and we continue to leave the code as is, which is mixed use with office and commercial, that whole property, the Spectre property, the Home Depot can be redeveloped with office and commercial.
But look at the
Up to 4
office building,
stories.
but look at the office building they built with Baptist. I never get traffic from that.
Right,
And that's open
when
from
that
9
came
or
to
8 in the
council,
morning to 6 o'clock in the evening.
when that came to council, that's a perfect example. When that came to council, and council had, it was a conditional use, when they looked at how the traffic was gonna be flowing, council specifically did not allow them to do left turn lane into the residential, left turn into residential from the back street. And that was a condition of approval for that property. So the council, when they reviewed the Baptist Health Center, they understood that traffic was going to be generated from the office use, their
So
medical office.
let's leave that, let's say that something like that gets put and redeveloped.
Right, they would
on
look
that
at things
property.
and then make sure that whatever's being done doesn't impact the residents.
But
The whole
that's what I'm
purpose
saying,
is that.
then why turn it into residential when you're incrementing 250, let's say minimum?
As I mentioned, council wants to introduce residential component to mixed use because it's the more modern way of developing shopping centers.
Okay, so if you look at a more modern way, look at the hideous buildings that they're creating in Coral Gables off the US1
Yep.
corridor. That looks like those buildings are gonna fall in.
Right, but this is 4-story. What Coral Gables is doing is 8 to 15. It's different. We're talking
Correct,
different
but I'm just
animals.
saying, that is a quote modern way, and it doesn't mean, because you said conditional, that means that 5 years from now, you can say, oh, you know what? This builder says he's gonna do this and give the citizens of Pinecrest this, so we're gonna allow them to do 6.
If the code says it's 4, in order for a developer to get more than that, they would have to apply for a variance, which is not what we're talking about. This is, the code is a hard 4 stories, is what they're setting up.
But the new vision plan includes still 6 stories,
Right,
doesn't it?
The vision
Wait,
plan.
and also says, talks about 8 stories.
Okay, the vision plan is a planning exercise that was done with residents. They made recommendations to the council. The vision plan that we had from 2012 also had 6 stories. That was never implemented because those are planning exercises. What gets implemented, what is our Bible, is our comprehensive master plan.
So why isn't it taken away from the vision plan? Can you
Because the
repeat
vision
it?
plan is just it's a planning exercise. It's just like, what could it be, what these residents felt we should be looking at. The council, what they're doing is not 6 stories. It is not hotel. It is not anything higher than 51 feet. It's not anything, that would allow ingress or egress into the residential. Everything is meant to be towards US1.
But
That
you
is
keep
what's
saying
happening.
that, but I've lived here 27 years. And 82nd was my pleasure road when I didn't want to take US1. 82nd now has become a main thoroughway.
Because everybody
for
did what you did, everybody found out.
No, that's because people don't want to be on US1.
The problem is that you have these apps like Waze that are now sending people through our residential roads because they're trying to find ways to get, and that's gonna be more and more as more and more people live south of us.
But as more and more people
More and more
go
people
into
will come here.
Pinecrest, we're going to have the same issue.
Hopefully the people that live in Pinecrest, if they're moving into US1, will use US1 because everyone that's living south of us is coming through
In the
like a
last,
sieve.
in the last week alone,
And
there have
then-
been 3 accidents on US1 where the light is, the marathon and I don't know what the gas station is. Cars flipped over. You're gonna tell me that if people are going to take US1?
I'm telling you that if the way that we are proposing development to occur is that all ingress and egress has to be onto US1, that when people are coming in or leaving those properties, they're gonna be going to US1.
Unless the council approves by the
Unless the council approves otherwise.
Well, that's very key,
Right.
that's a key statement.
But,
Well,
I mean, that's why they're elected
Let's-
officials, they're duly elected officials to represent, and they make, that is their job, that's what you put them in office to do.
But if, you know, if this is an example how things are decided and the variance between what people want and what the council wants is amazing. That is one thing. I'd like to hear numbers. Numbers will make perfect sense. For each the thing is it true now we're moving from 100% commercial in these areas to 37.5% commercial only, the 62% can be residential. Is it true that's the maximum?
I don't know the math.
I mean, I'm asking you, what's the percentage of residential that you are allowing? What's in any case? That's one. The other thing is, how many parking space per unit are you requiring? And what size unit? Like if it is a 4-bedroom apartment, if it is a 2-bedroom apartment, how does it change the parking?
With regard to unit size, we're increasing the minimum required size from 600 square feet to 1,000 square feet. So the minimum allowable size for a dwelling unit is now 1,000 square feet.
If they pass.
If it's approved.
Okay. And
with regard to percentages, we don't really look at it in terms of percentages. What is allowed is 35 dwelling units per acre. Right now it's 12 within the mixed use districts, 12 units per acre, and that's recommended to be increased to 35 units per acre. And then with regard to parking, parking is required as for most uses required to be in compliance with Division 5.22, which is our parking standards of the land development regulations, with the exception of restaurants and commercial. And yes, there's a reduction in the number of reduction in the amount of parking that is recommended for restaurants, for residential units, and for retail. There's a proposed reduction in the amount of parking. The thinking is that some of those parking standards were so restrictive that they're not any longer realistic. For example, to require 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit, when a lot of the dwelling units are only going to be 1,000 square feet, they're going to be occupied by single family, possibly single home.
Those are giant assumptions, Steve.
So those are the recommendations that were made to the village council that came out of the Pinecrest Parkway US1 Forward Revision Plan. So yes, to answer your question, there is a proposed reduction in the amount of parking required for retail, residential, and restaurants.
Honestly, commercial is not my concern. My concern is the residential, because that's the main increase. We're going to have 62% residential as out of the project. And if you tell me one apartment will have 1 parking, I mean, if you think of it of practicality, that's very much unpractical, because we are not in Manhattan where everyone and everything is relying on public transportation. The relying on public transportation can be one person going to work and back. You cannot take your schools by public transportation. You cannot take your kids to after-school activities by public transportation. You cannot, so many places you cannot, but public transportation is overrepresented here and it's not gonna be used.
So the thinking is,
Up to a point,
the thought process was that there's going to be less demand for vehicular parking also because the uses are in close proximity to transit. Presumably they'll be using, some of them will be using transit. Also, they're smaller units, so they're not going to have as large a family that is going to be living in these units as you have in the estate districts of the village of Pinecrest. And also, our current code allows for shared parking. So where you have uses that are open during the day and some that are open during the night, rather than requiring all of those uses to provide the same number of spaces, we look at the hours that those businesses are open and allow businesses that are open during the day to share parking spaces, basically. Which allows for a substantial reduction where a shared parking plan is approved. So would be glad to take a look at these parking ratios again, but these were the recommendations of our consultants for a mixed-use project.
Has the council taken in consideration the survey that was done, the visioning survey that was done?
They've taken into consideration all the documents, everything that's been done for the last 2 years, including public meetings, surveys, meetings with HOA. They have had, over 30 meetings.
Why is it not on the website, the survey?
That is not an accurate statement. They are on the website. I mentioned it earlier. All the information, everything, videotapes of every meeting that's been videotaped, all of that information is on our website. I'm sorry, let me just take a call and then John in the back, go ahead.
So I have 2 quick questions. When a developer brings in a project, you say they do traffic studies. Who does those traffic studies?
So the developer would submit their traffic study, and then the village has our own traffic engineers. Independent, that reviews the traffic study.
Okay, and then the other question is, actually a small question is for Steve. Recently, the property on 136, it's the Spectre property, they had a small change in what's allowed. I'm not sure if it became multi-use or mixed use. It was something like that. Council member Kraft proposed it, or he talked about it, and then it was voted on. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I don't recall what you're talking about with regard to the Spectre's property.
Yeah.
36. Councilmember Kraft talked about the traffic that's generated by a Home Depot, for example, versus other uses, but I don't recall any change to the permitted uses or?
Something was changed there, and his justification was that it was the only commercial block that didn't have that allowance or that use, and it was changed. Because I mentioned it when we had the town hall at, Pinecrest Park. I asked him during a meeting, so it's something.
Are you sure that it was changed or that he proposed it and maybe nothing came of it?
That's a possibility.
Because I don't recall any changes being made at all.
All right, I'll go back and look at those. All right.
Like, if you give me kind of a date frame, if you kind of remember when it happened, I can go back and look at it. There has not been any code change to that property, I can tell you. John? Hi, John.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions that may have been covered earlier. I'm sorry, my power went out for 2.5 hours, so, oh well. I don't have underground, they have it across the street. Anyway, on 2 stories with single family, and of course that applies to me. What is, are you saying the maximum you can do 2 stories on any building? Up until US1, or are you talking about the step up?
It's the step up. So adjacent to you, John happens to live right behind the roasters and toasters. Right. So adjacent to you, where they do the residential component on the rear.
It's the same as the other.
But they would drop it to 2-story maximum. So you'll have a tiered effect, but immediately adjacent to you, instead of having commercial back to back to you, it would have the residential component there, plus landscape buffer, an opaque.
But you still can have a 4-story building.
You can have 4-story, but it will be closer to US1 from you. In your case, it will have the 2-story right behind you.
And as I understand it, it's 30 feet, then 30 feet. than 30 feet. It's still gonna, you're still gonna see that big building. And 4 stories is not small.
Right.
With all due respect.
But you can build a
Right
4-story
next-
now right behind you.
And the other thing is, are you saying single-family homes or single-family zoning? Because
No,
duplex.
what
And
happens is, it's like a transitional use. It's still zoned, the underlying zoning, whatever it is. That zoning doesn't change. All it does is provide that any residential component be towards the rear so that where it buds
Including
you.
duplex,
I'm sorry?
including duplex?
I don't know that they would have duplex. I mean, I suppose they could come in with a duplex zoning as a part of the transitional zoning if they wanted to come in with a development that has duplexes or townhouses. It's possible that that could happen. Yeah, because we don't dictate what kind of mixed residential. We talk about townhomes or any other residential. So it's possible that they could come in with a concept that would have duplex. It would just be, all of that would be abutting immediately to the residential.
The other thing is, back when we did the first North Pinecrest business, this plan went to the state.
Right.
And they came back and said you are required to have low-cost housing within that building, which is the 600 square feet.
Right.
So remember, we're going back to the state, and it's possible they'll come back and say, you got it, and that's why we put the small units back in. I was on that committee that, in the design, just.
We're hoping, we haven't heard anything, go ahead.
Just to address that, in 2009, the state law was changed. So, and then it got changed again in 2011. So the process that went through in 2002 was much different than the process we go through now. Back then, you're right, the state would object on certain issues, one of them being affordable housing. Today, their jurisdiction is much more limited in that they can only object on issues of an important state interest. So they rarely object these days, and we don't anticipate that they would raise that objection.
And my point is, I think that's good if we can
Make
keep
it
1,000 square feet.
Yeah.
The other thing I just want to comment on is because it's been said that we had a citizens committee, which we did in this program. But remember, the citizens committee was architects, engineers, and landscape guys. It wasn't this guy a neighbor and this guy a neighbor. And so I think it's a little misleading to call it a citizens quote-unquote group. Not that I object to who you had on the committee, but it really didn't include a resident or two that were not totally in favor of what's going on.
So the purpose of that committee, they all are residents of Pinecrest. They are professional architects, engineers, urban planners, and landscape architects, was because when you're looking at how to develop something, they're the ones that have the expertise to be able to say, this is feasible in the market or not. And so there's a value that they bring in.
In the what market?
In the market, in the market, you know.
But you see, I'm not saying that was wrong to have them on the committee. But I say, when you say citizens committee, it kind of sounds like these are the neighbors.
But they are citizens and they are neighbors.
I know,
Yeah,
but you misinterpret what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, politically, it's not right to just make it sound like these are citizens off the street.
Because they're professionals and we're not.
You know what I'm saying? I just think politically it doesn't sound right. And I think it should be said when you refer to the committee, these are professionals in the business, and leave it at that. But it just politically it doesn't sound right.
Okay.
Include long-term residents.
The other thing that I personally object to is the original plan next to my house was 12 and a half units per acre.
Right.
And it's now being boosted up to 35, and that's a lot more. I mean, it's 5 acres, 35, that's 165, 170 units versus 12 and a half, which is 60 units. And I really don't particularly go along with that. I just want my point of view made, okay?
John, one of the things I did want to say, which I know you came in a little after, so I'm not sure if you heard me say it, that a lot of times the developers won't be able to even build to the maximum dwelling units an acre because you have height restrictions, you have setback restrictions, you have open space. So it's very likely, like Doug Kulig, who's one of the architects that was on the advisory board, explained that more than likely these things would be built at a 25 unit an acre standard, just because you have so many other standards that are pushing, you know, like height restrictions, setback restrictions. So when it's all said and done, we don't do zero lot lines. So all those things play a role and will diminish the amount of buildable space, just FYI.
But if that's the case, that's what it should be.
Exactly.
That's the point I'm making, because you're not creating an atmosphere for somebody to do something. At 12 and a half units, the purpose was you have some apartments and you have businesses also. And what you're doing when you do more units, you reduce the amount of business. And quite honestly, across the way in Dayland South, there's big office buildings there. It would be more convenient for businesses to, like office buildings and like offices, to be in that area to provide for the use of the metro rail, because those guys are doing business back and forth. It's just, I think somebody should revisit the number of units. That's my point, okay?
Why was that increased? What's the logic behind that?
Yeah.
Why don't you go from total 24? Why did you have to go to?
It's the number of 35 units an acre. It's a standard that the federal government uses in support of rapid transit. So the federal government has different standards, and a mid-rise dwelling unit standard that supports rapid transit is considered 35. So that's where it came from that. Yeah.
Well, the feds are wrong.
So I know we've gone for a while, so are there any lingering questions? I appreciate everybody's time.
The last question.
Sure.
Why are we rushing through this in December? Isn't there like a special election in the next years? Like why are we rushing?
So this is a process that the council goes through. As I mentioned earlier, it's a 2-year process. So it's not a rushed process. We've been going through this process of developing the vision for US1 and coming up with code changes for 2 years. So at this juncture, we've already passed the first. We wait for the state to provide us input, whether it comes in December or January, it depends, so you need to keep an eye out. We'll notify people as soon as we know if it's going on to December, but it's definitely not rushed. It's just, that is the process. We've gone through it. It's multiple years worth of discussion, meetings, input to develop these changes, and council's ready to move on it.
What do you mean by the second reading? I don't understand.
So every code change, when you're changing the code or the comprehensive master plan, any ordinance requires 2 public hearings, one at first reading and one at second reading. So it's 2 different public hearings, 2 different dates. We already had the first hearing on October 12th, which is everything that I went over today is what they already voted on and approved. Now there's second reading would happen like more than likely December 13th. So any questions or any concerns that you have between now and then, I would urge you to either call the council members or write to them any concerns, like, you know, not enough parking. Whatever those things that come to mind that you want them to consider, you should write to the council, because that will inform their decision making when they revisit this. And you can also come to that meeting and offer your input, you know. My goal today was that you would be here at least knowing what's in the existing ordinances and have a clear understanding of what they're voting on, and then you guys can form your own opinions on whether you're in favor or against it.
where the voting is gonna take place? Is it gonna take place in?
It's at the council chamber. So all the meetings happen at the municipal center. So there's limited, it's a small space.
Exactly.
So if you
How,
want to
but
be.
how many of us can attend?
There's only, in the chamber, there's room for like 38 seats. And then we're gonna be taking turns to allow people to go upstairs. We do that there because there's a different level of security there. And based on what's happening, you know, that also has the ability to do the streamlined video and for people to zoom in. So you can also attend the meeting virtually from your home, and you would raise your hands. They give you a link, and you can speak to council from the comfort of your home. So if you don't want to sit in the hot air downstairs waiting to be able to get in, you know, or whatever, you can do it from the comfort of your home, and you watch the meeting there and raise your hand and speak when it's time, when they open the public hearing from your home.
There's not even enough parking.
Yeah.
Many people are.
The parking, when there's parking, this is open, so you can always park here, and there isn't a connection through here to the back to get into the municipal center. So there's parking here at this facility and at the municipal center that day.
Are they gonna be
Or you
police
can do public
officers?
There'll be police officers there for the, you know, for the security screening into the building. That always happens. Mr. Chairman?
As your newest council member, having gone to all these meetings and been to council meetings and seen what goes on, I talked to a number of people that had complaints about what was going on, what they thought was being ramrodded through, and what the council was in the pockets of developers and all kinds of crazy stories like that. I don't really think any of that's true. In talking to a lot of them, I say, well, have you talked to your council member? Have you talked to the mayor? None. Well, you gotta talk to us, right? I mean, I have a paving company. I've lived here since 1992. My 2 kids went to public school here. I have played in the parks for 20-some years. I'm listening to this meeting today, and I hear a lot of concerns about things that people don't understand that I sort of do. Like, I know with schools, there's going to be some concurrency. There's going to be issues. Things just don't get built. They have to meet certain thresholds. John, I appreciate you had a great point. Why do we have that many units when you probably couldn't get more than maybe 15 units on that property? But that's kind of interesting. Those are things, council members aren't elected because they know everything. Hopefully they're elected because they're reasonable people that care about the community. So we need good information, good questions, and not a lot of panic. Because I know years ago, I was on 60th Avenue, years ago, I got to your point about why aren't people in favor of this here. Generally, people that are happy about stuff aren't showing up to the meetings. A decade and a half ago, I got a notice that a sidewalk was being built down 60th Avenue. It was being built. It wasn't being discussed. It was as a done deal. It was happening. I went to the meeting, that following meeting, just because I had concerns about exactly where through my yard it was going to go and how it was going to be handled. Well, I was the one person that wanted the sidewalk that was there. There were 10 people that were just mad as hell. Didn't want a sidewalk down 60th Avenue. It would bring in a bad element. My parties, I'd get tickets. There was like 9 or 10 different stories, and they were all just utter BS. But the council shut down that sidewalk project, which I thought was completely wrong because the people that wanted it had no choice to be there because they wanted it. We were told it was going to be there. So I think, sometimes the council listens in the wrong way as well. And that's part of the problem.
It's not happening
on some of these issues. The mad people, and I've talked to a couple friends that I know that are very concerned about this, but they don't have a lot of good information, and they don't, it's...
In all due respect, on this particular issue, the village sent out a survey, and it came back overwhelmingly against what's being proposed. Overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
Then they held a meeting at Pinecrest Gardens. 200 plus people showed up there. Overwhelmingly, whatever it is.
I was at that one, yes.
Overwhelmingly against what's going on.
Right, Mike, what they said at that meeting was, if you leave it at 4 stories, we'll be happy.
Well, I
That was
don't
what was
recall
said at
that.
that meeting.
I don't recall that. I
I
recall that
looked
being.
at the tapes, that's what was said, and they
Okay.
said if you do a committee with the residents committee,
But you
let's
did a,
slow it down,
but you did a
we'll be
committee,
happy, and
but
it's
you did a
happened.
committee with a bunch of developers.
A year later,
Yossi, I was speaking, I didn't interrupt you.
But, and also with all due respect, that's a lot of conspiracy going on. My angle is, they tried to do
Let me
this.
finish.
Well, I was.
So what happened was you got a bunch of residents together, right or wrong, I'm not taking a side, right or wrong, said, we don't like the way this is happening. So they went out and got the signatures, got a referendum done to pass a charter amendment to stop exactly what's happening here from going forward. Was done before the first reading of this ordinance, was approved in terms of the signatures. And the council, in spite of all of that, everything that anybody has said, you may be right, there may be a silent majority that needs to get more vocal that would like to see this. But right now, the people that are against this are vastly in the majority of people that are seen, okay? There are people that are seen. And they got this referendum together. And I sat with Joe, who said there'd be no vote on this because of that referendum. And they've now ran it through.
Right.
And that's ramming it through.
And why would it be wrong?
And
There's a lot of conspiracy going on.
if that referendum passes, then the council has ignored the will of the people.
Well, if you want to talk about the referendum, which I don't know if I want to get into right now, but look how complicated this whole subject is.
Mhm.
There's 18,000 plus residents in Pinecrest, 15,000 some voters. I forget what the number is, but it's a pretty high number of voters. We're gonna get them all, to, well, you're not good with numbers anyhow, by your own admission. I'm not sure but I'm saying, look at,
So what's your
look
opinion,
at
that
the
they
confusion.
should just decide, and we don't, we
Yeah,
don't
this
have
is
to take
for
another.
18,000 people.
And the information,
What's
this
that?
information, and we're gonna get every
Sound like a
voter
democracy.
to understand the nuance of Greer ratio and everything else. That's why there's a staff, that's why there's a council, and that's why the council is supposed to be.
But I thought in the United States, a question.
Exactly, reflecting the percentage.
thank you all for coming. As far as this meeting is concerned,
You're
we're done.
adjourned.
You guys wanna go talk outside, that'd be great.
See you later.
Thank you. Call me, text me if you have any questions, or email me if you have any questions.